Roberto Bendini. As Mark said, I'm working for the study department in the European Parliament. What you have seen, the little report is a sort of document we have recently decided to publish outside the Parliament on some issues that may be of interest for parliamentarians traveling to China, also meeting with Chinese delegations. So we are going to be relatively short, perhaps if there are then questions, but I would like to touch upon some elements on both economic situation and some trade aspects of our relations from a wider viewpoint. But of course, we are also ready to go into some detail if you need. So, well, one point, this is quoted in the report, this comes from the United States about IPR, but I think can be applied to the whole situation of Chinese trade, is that real progress has been made by China over the last 20 years in terms of opening the market, making a more functioning market, and reducing some distortions, but there is still a lot to do. That is the one point, it's pretty clear. The situation is that it's not entirely the same in all the sectors. So there are some sectors that are rather liberalized, others are not. There are some sectors where there is a massive support, either direct or indirect, by the government or local governments or other institutions or bank institutions, for instance, and others that are more or less working without that kind of support. So this is the first point. It's when looking at China in terms of system, we needed to distinguish between the different situations. So the solar case is certainly one which was considered to be particularly important for the government. The green the drift to green technology has been put forward as one of the top priorities for the Chinese government. The problem is that, of course, the consumption, but you correct me if I'm wrong, is limited in China, and the industry is more or less completely export-oriented, which means, of course, that somebody else has to pay the bill. Beyond that, there are other sectors you have seen in the report that are considered strategic. Some are in the services, that is not entirely liberalized. There are huge sectors that are still close to external competitors. As far as industry is concerned, for instance, there was these two big cases in the WTO on metals, and then the rare earths were partly solved. But of course, this showed that the Chinese government tends to have a sort of attention in protecting its domestic industry by providing some specific, let's say, better conditions for them to develop and to make to keep their competitiveness. This means that some initiatives are, as you have seen, were attacked by the European Union, others were not. It depends a little bit because there are also some political implications. But overall, if you look at the statistics, if you look at the increase in trade in between European Union and China, we can say that our trade is relatively liberalized. Of course, again, it depends on the sector. Certainly, the alloy sector is not the one that is the happiest, but others, for instance, if you speak about some luxury goods or some spirits, are very happy with that. So this is the first point. Coming back to the points on, let's say, the irritants, the aspects that are seen as a potential trade barrier in between China and European Union. Well, for China, it's relatively easy. One is market economy status. As I said, it's a political issue for the Chinese government. Other issues are the same for all exporters to Europe, which means that some standards, some regulations, some rules that have to apply to all imports. Some third countries are seeing this as a sort of potential trade barrier, but they apply to all exporters and producers, irrespective of the source of the products or the service. So this means that, in fact, there is no real discrimination. Another point, but again, this is partly caused by the Chinese, is some complaints we had last year when I was engaging the parliamentarians of the National Parliamentary Assembly of China. I raised this point about procurement. They say, well, we cannot make some bids and do your market because your rules are too strict. Of course, I don't think it's very much the time to have a large number of Chinese workers coming to Europe and responding to social and let's say other rules that are not Chinese, but are European. But the point here is the following: China endorsed in 2001 in the Protocol of Accession the fact that they were going to access to the General Agreement on Procurement, and they didn't. What they were making were offers that were very much limited. They were not covering a number of municipalities, a number of sectors, and in the end, although some progress over the years was made, this was considered by both United States and Europe insufficient. Again, this is another sector where there are some serious problems. Moving on the other side, moving to Europe, what Mark said, it's correct. There are, as you know as well, some limits in terms of IPR protection, although they are improving. It's normal, I think. By the time that the Chinese companies are developing their own brands, their own products that are, let's say, upmarket or high technology, they are going to tend to protect themselves against competitors inside their market. So in a longer run, I guess that some of the problems we are facing with China are going to be solved. The question is, of course, that whether there will be still some industry or services to be exported to China, but that's another element. Well, another couple of points, perhaps before concluding, and then there are also some macroeconomic elements that may be taken into consideration. First of all, for the moment, China is supporting the world economy because with their expected growth of 7.5%, 8% this year, is certainly helping in keeping some demand, and this is becoming more and more important also for European industries. I mean, it would be wrong to say that we do not export anything to China. Of course, we have a large trade deficit, but China is becoming more and more important. You know, if there is anybody here from Volkswagen, for instance, they will be telling you that they are making more sales in China than in Europe now. So there are some industries that are taking real advantage in producing and exporting to China. The problem is, of course, that, first of all, at the moment, and despite the economic crisis, some protectionist temptations were kept relatively under control, so there were no major problems. But it's clearly important that, as well as Europe, also China should keep its market open. So we should fight against any kind of restriction in terms of, let's say, market access that is not justified by the WTO. So this is the first point. The other point that is a little bit, as I said, worrisome, is that the system is not entirely working in a transparent way. Well, one may say that also in the United States and Europe we were not performing very well. But if you see how the situation is evolving in terms of financing to certain industries in China, how the situation is evolving in terms of support by local governments, it is even escaping the control of central governments. And then I can tell you a story about, you will be discovering that, of course, there are some elements that needed to be fixed, that needed to be analyzed, because, of course, this may lead to some, let's say, some problems in the system with some implications also for the European economy. The case was the following. I was in 2002 in China with the Commission at that time was still safeguards, and they were talking about production of steel. And the central government representatives say, well, we are not entirely sure about the production in China, you know, because we don't know exactly what are the statistics at provincial level. You know, but the problem is that you can hide relatively easily a textile mill, but a steel mill, you know, with a consumption. So it means as well that the entire control of the government is not ensured. There are sometimes some problems that are very much important in terms of how works the economy. If you see as well the kind of stimulus that was provided by provincial governments or by local governments to Chinese companies, sometimes illegal, is still not entirely under the control of the central government, and this is, of course, rather a source of preoccupation. So I guess that in very short words, but as I said, you can have a look to the report. This is what I want to say, and I'm ready to respond to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Roberto. Any questions for Roberto before we move on to the line? Okay, no questions.
So you mentioned that for China, market economy status is mainly a political problem, but the European Commission tends to view this more in a technical way. So do you see any problem with this, like in this mismatch between the political approach versus the technical approach?
Yeah, well, as I said, I mean, this is the position of China in the sense that when you see the disproportionate importance that market economy status has for the Chinese government, you may ask yourself whether there were no other, let's say, battles to be fought. The same was for TPSSN, that was de facto never used because China opposed to that. So my feeling is that, of course, there are some technical criteria to be met. But countries, serious countries like Australia and New Zealand, for instance, for political reasons, already granted market economy status to China. So it doesn't mean that these criteria apply to all the countries in the same way. You know, in the end, it's a final decision. I guess we had a discussion with Mark a few days ago. It will also depend on what the United States are going to do with market economy status, because if one of the two big blocks grants market economy status, the other one is going to be very, very much under strain to do the same. But again, it's still a political matter. And it's a political matter that is no more under, for Europeans, under the hands of the Council alone, but is also the Parliament. And as you know, the Parliament sometimes has diverging positions compared to the Council. So what we could expect in 2016 or whenever the Commission decides to put forward the proposal is that we are going to have a debate on the 5 criteria, because this is our law, this is what we were supposed to verify, and then in the end we are going to have a final decision, a political decision. But this is something that, as I say, that is not for now. And on the other hand, I think it's also good for China in a way, because if there are some clear criteria to be met, and there are some, let's say, legitimate, causes that prevent from granting this market economy status, I think it's also good for them. And in a way, if you look at the situation for the solar panel case, how can you say that there was no support or there was real, let's say, full market oriented development of this sector in China? If you see the statistics, it's very much prompting some questions. And this is not the only one. So I think the Chinese know very well what the situation is. They use this as a sort of excuse, because another point I was not mentioning. China is negotiating agreements with practically all countries in the world except the United States and Europe. Okay? We have the Chinese safari for raw materials in Africa. They are making a lot of business in Latin America. Asia is becoming their backyard. Thanks. So you see, we are not saying that China is not concluding any agreements. They are even starting discussing with Korea and Japan in creating a large trading bloc, although there are some political problems. But from another viewpoint, we have a PCA for which negotiations were open in 2007 and still lagging behind. We have an old agreement that was signed in 1985 that is almost no trade provisions. And 1985 for China is like, speaking about, the prehistoric era, is very, very, very much ancient times. If you see the statistics, it's not the same kind of China. Now we have an investment agreement. The Commission say, well, we are going to launch this exercise as soon as possible, but we haven't seen anything in 6 months or so. So what I see is that China, in my opinion, is relatively happy with the situation. They use market economy status, the weapon embargo, and other issues to say, well, we are not ready to discuss with you. But on the other hand, they know that in the end they have access to the market in a way that is relatively open and fair, at least for the wider picture, not speaking about specific sectors.
Question, Justin.
If China is granted market economy status in 2016, what would happen in your opinion? What changes would it make? Have you made any projections?
But there are no studies, but I can tell you there will be probably, let's say, lower anti-dumping margin. We are going to see a higher number of countervailing duty investigations that are going to compensate in part what is the situation. But again, it depends very much on the future of anti-dumping. If you see what, again, let's leave aside some specific cases like the solar panels. The European Union is opening a reduced number of cases compared to other third countries. There is a sort of, let's say, refraining from opening these cases. So there will be probably some impact for certain industries, but I don't see, indeed, in a general picture, it is not going to change very much. For certain sectors, yes, of course, this is the point. But this is sectoral. It's not in the general picture. If you see about statistics, about the number of cases, about the impact on the economy, this is really no impact. It's political and sectoral, of course.